So most of what we've seen as a growth in our wealth, our growth in the consumption levels we have come from that increase in energy. And now we're cooking with gas in that sense, because we're finally acknowledging the role of energy in production. But that's not what neoclassicals are doing, of course.
I'd like to welcome Professor Steve Keen back to the podcast. Steve is author of Debunking Economics and the New Economics, a Manifesto. Steve is, among many other things, a research fellow at the Institute for Strategy, Resilience, and Security at University College in London. He is writing a new book, and today we discuss one of the chapters in his book, which is a economic sleuth story on the origins of energy blindness. We go back all the way to Adam Smith and look at a series of wrong turns in the road that classical and then neoclassical economists made on the treatment of land, energy, and things that are not capital and labor. This is a difficult podcast. Steve is an economist, talks in a lot of economist language. I barely understood what he was saying, but I did understand the critical importance of his main message, is that our main shaman of our culture today, those that we look to for answers and explanations of what's happening and what will happen in the future, are truly divorced from our biophysical and ecological reality in their formulas. So this ultimately is a really big deal. There's a chapter in Steve's upcoming book on that, but this is a 1.5 hour treatment of energy blindness and its origins. Please welcome back to the show, Steve Keen. Steve Keen, good to see you.
Good to be back again, mate. Good to talk.
This is a monumental podcast for 3 reasons. 1, it's my last podcast of 2023 recording. 2, it's my first podcast on prep for a colonoscopy, so hopefully we won't have to interrupt it too many times. And 3rd, I think this is you have just finished a detective story about a concept that I often talk about, energy blindness. I know the result of why our culture, why our institutions are energy blind, but you have just written a book and a chapter on the energy production function, and you've gone back to the original papers from the classical and neoclassical economists and figured out why humanity has over time completely neglected the role of energy in our descriptions of wealth and productivity. So we could talk about climate change. You know a lot about that. We could talk about money. You know a lot about that, and we probably should. But today, I want to just unpack your story of what you've been working on the last couple months with respect to energy blindness.
Okay, let's roll. First
all right,
question.
So take me to the beginning.
Okay.
We had classical economists back in the day, right?
Yeah, and virtually every economist, if you ask them who's the father of economics, going to answer Adam Smith. And in a sense, I was inclined that way, except that I've read previous economists to Smith as well, including the Physiocrats. And my attitude was that the Physiocrats were more advanced on important issues, both macroeconomics and the role of energy in production than
Who
Smith
were the
was.
Physiocrats?
They were a bunch of 19th and 18th century French, mainly French, but also some Irish economists who worked in France. And this is before we actually had the term of economist in many ways. So there were people who were trying to analyze how the production system works. And they're called Physiocrats because the leading personality, the leading intellect in the group was Francois Quenet, and Quenet was the physician to the King of France. And he was working at the time when we were having the very first autopsies to find out, what was inside a body, because for a long time in the West there were religious rules against carving open a dead body, and then we started to do it. And Kane was involved in this. He found all these tubes running all over the body, and had this vision of a system of circulation for the body. And then when it came to looking at the economy, they had the same idea. There's a system of circulation. Goods go from one spot to another, money goes in the opposite direction, and there was this sense of saying we can see the economy as a dynamic system in the same way we're now realizing the body is, because all these tubes flow down and flow back up again. The arteries go through the body, they become veins, come back up again. There's circulation of blood, there's mixing of blood with oxygen, all these sorts of things were the vision. And in that sense, the basic paradigm they started from wasn't mechanics, as neoclassical economists have ended up doing. It was biology. And that was a far more sensible starting place.
And so instead of calling them bureaucrats, they were physicians that were advising the king, so they called them physiocrats.
Well, the most dominant personality was Kane, and there's two combinations. So he was a physician for the king, literally the king's physician. Now that did two things: it gave him enormous prominence. It also gave him plenty of spare time, because you've only got one person to occasionally have to do something medical with. So for the rest of the time, he was working in trying to work, and the interest was in how the economy functions as a sort of monetary and physical goods version of a body circulation system.
This was in the 18th century in Europe?
1700s, yeah. So,
right.
And they were trying, as people like William Petty was trying to work out how the economy functioned in England at similar times, Smith afterwards, of course. But the curious thing about being based in France is that France at the time, compared to Scotland, we're not comparing France to England, but France to Scotland because of Smith, France was still overwhelmingly agricultural. Okay, agriculture dominated production in France. You had some level of manufacturing, but nothing like what was developing in Scotland at the time. Smith's book came out, I think, the same year as the very first James Watt steam engine was sold, but of course we had the previous models before, which are much less efficient, were still steam engines, and you had steam power and water power and wind power being used in all the factories in Scotland. But from the point of view of the Physiocrats, they said, well, what they was looking at was rural France, and what they saw was the farmer would plant one seed and 1,000 seeds would come out of it. And so their orientation was that wealth comes from the land, and it isn't the labor that goes into making something that gives it the value. They didn't even talk about that. Well, they did, but as a secondary factor. So they said the source of wealth is the land, and the husbandman, as they call the farmer, is the one who exploits what they call the free gift of nature. And their perspective was, first of all, to say that the land is the source of all value. That was the opening 4 or 5 words of Richard Cantillon's An Essay in Economic Theory, which was published in French 21 years before Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. First of all, for the French, not only did Smith read French, he was in France taking a young nobleman around for education and met Kane. So he was quite aware of the literature in French before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And we'll never know whether Smith derived his ideas partially from the Physiocrats and interactions with them, because he insisted that all his notes were burnt upon his death, so we don't have any long-term record of the influences on Smith. But this school of thought was very strong, and it had a definitive foundation for explaining where wealth came from, and it wasn't from labor, it was from land.
And then there was steam engines, and we were off to the races, and our stories changed, influenced by Adam Smith.
Well, that's much right in the wrong direction, because what the Physiocrats also said was, of course, with land, they said, well, the land receives the free gift of nature, and that had many potential meanings, but it fundamentally, from our perspective, looking back, it was energy. because the sun's energy lands on the soil, the plants absorb the energy, the plants grow. The husbandman's actual labor is far less important than the productivity of the soil and the exposure to the natural elements, the climate, the sunshine coming in. And that was the source of wealth. And they said the husbandman is the only source of wealth. And if you look at it, at the writings that people like Turgot and Cantillon and Quenet had, and you look at it from the point of view that you and I have of the role of energy in production, they are fundamentally saying the free gift of energy is what enables us to produce anything. And what is often would be called the surplus by other schools of thought is the gap between the energy put in by the husbandman and the energy retrieved. And there's a wonderful sentence from Turgot where he says the husbandman receives the free gift of nature, which he did not pay for and which he sells. Okay?
Well,
It's beautiful.
that's a microcosm of our entire economic system today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the Physiocrats had it right. The one mistake they made, and this is the thing where the whole thing fell over, and Smith played a role in this, is that they could not see the same thing in manufacturing. So what they saw for manufacturing is that manufacturing receives the output of the agricultural sector and transforms it into some different form, but does not add value. Now, what we know, of course, is that manufacturing also receives the free gift of nature in the sense that we're exploiting fossil fuel energy, which has been there for millions of years, but it's basically stored solar power. And without that input in manufacturing, there'd be no production for manufacturing either. And at the same point, the manufacturing transformed the free gift of nature, which is raw energy, into useful energy. So the sensible perspective would have been to go from the Physiocrats' vision of the role of agriculture to then say, well, it's also in manufacturing. And Smith could have done that because Smith could have thought, well, we don't have much farming in Scotland comparatively compared to France, but we do have manufacturing. And in manufacturing, we're using the free gift of nature as well. We're putting coal into the early steam engines. We've got water power, which is another gift of nature, wind power to some extent, but predominantly it was steam power and charcoal power beginning, and coal. Coal is becoming very important, becoming dominant actually before Smith published The Wealth of Nations. So he could have said, well, that's also the free gift of nature, but he didn't. What he said instead was labor is the source of value. What you have out of that is a switch from seeing the external, the existing universe being the source of us transforming the inputs we find there into something useful for us, which is consistent with the laws of thermodynamics, into labor being the source of wealth and division of labor being the source of growth of wealth. And this is all effectively inside the economy. There's no reference to outside the economy. So I see Smith, by simply changing one word, you have Richard Cantillon saying that land is the source of wealth, to Smith saying labor is the source of wealth. And that completely pushed economics off the rails.
We can only speculate why that happened, but possibly because Scotland was further along on industrialization, and all of a sudden we had this wealth and higher goods and services than a few decades earlier, and there was maybe a human exceptionalism dynamic. Look at how clever we are and how industrious our citizens of Scotland are. We're creating these machines and we're creating this productivity. And so that statement, that shift from the focus of free gifts from nature to the husbandman, the farmer or the laborer, that was the origin of our current energy blindness, you're saying?
I think so. And like, I can't criticize Smith for this. I mean, I say it's a great pity, but I can't criticize him because he had no idea of the consequences. He didn't know the laws of thermodynamics. You can't criticize him for breaching something which wasn't developed for a century after he actually spoke. But when you look at I'm going to look at some
and
of the...
even the word energy was invented after he wrote Wealth of Nations, I think.
Either 1802 or 1809, I think. And so the word itself was, it was taken from Greek, but it was made up in the early 18th century by an English
19th century.
early 19th century. It's
Yeah.
easy to make that mistake.
No. I always get that confused too. Sorry, I interrupted you. You were saying.
It's coined in 1802. So we can't blame them for not using post language, and we can't blame Smith for not knowing that there's a law of conservation of energy.
The story continues, though. It wasn't just Smith. The Ayres compounded. So what's next?
Well, the next stage is once Smith said that labor is the source of all value and division of labor is the increase in value and wealth. Initially, that was used by Smith and Ricardo to attack feudalism and argue in favor of capitalism. When you look at the role that the classical theory of economics played, it was to promote trade, it was to promote freedom of movement and freedom of enterprise against all the restrictions of the feudal system. So in that sense, it was pro-capitalist, and that was the way in which it was used by Smith and Ricardo. Nobody regarded Smith and Ricardo as calling for the overthrow of capitalism, but along comes Marx. Now, Marx, not only Marx, but plenty of what they call Ricardian socialists before Marx turned up, who took the same idea that if labor is a source of value, why is the wage not equal to the entire product? Why does profit exist? Okay. That was the twist that was then taken of the interpreting the classical argument that labor is the source of wealth. Say, well, if we're the source of wealth, why don't we get it? And you have to go back and think about the state of industry in the 18th and early 19th centuries. I'm going to fall over that 21st century thing in the 1900s all the damn time. But if you think about the state of Scotland at the time, if I have any analogy to what it was like, it was Calcutta in the 1950s. It was stench everywhere from from pigs being disemboweled, chemicals pumping out, smoke out of the chimney stacks, etc., etc. And I've forgotten who coined the phrase of the dark satanic mills, but that was what Scotland looked like at the time. And you had people who used to work in an agricultural environment with quite a few rights that peasants had back in that time, who were pushed through the enclosures movement, became landless labourers fundamentally, had to work in the industrial systems, then found themselves working 14-hour days, normally 6 days a week, thank God for the Sabbath, but 6 days a week, often sleeping inside the factories. It wasn't exactly going to conducive to making you think what a great system capitalism is. On the other hand, of course, the capitalists themselves were benefiting from all this and bleeding the industrialization and so on, and the technological change, they thought it was great. So what you had was for the working class and for the urban poor, Ricardian and Smithian economics became a ground for arguing for revolution and for a fairer share of what's being produced. And that political shift was brought to a head by Marx starting in 1857. Well, he's prominent well before then, but 1857 with his work on what's called the Grundrisse, and arguments for developing Marx's particular version of the classical theory. And Marx was far more eloquent than saying capitalists exploit labor. He actually said capitalists pay workers precisely what they deserve to be paid in the commodity production system. They get their means of subsistence. That's the cost of reproducing the worker. That's it's a gain for the buyer of labour power, that there's a gap between labour and labour power, but by no means an injustice to the seller. That's a quote from Marx. But anyway, what you got was Marx being used as the means for saying, let's have a revolution. And now in that setting, the classical school, from being regarded as positive by the capitalist class and the ruling class,
the classical school being Adam Smith and the like.
Adam Smith, Ricardo, and through to ultimately to Marx.
Okay.
But all the time there was a subgroup which was called, had no particular name, but they were what I'd call Proto-Neoclassical Economists. And the most prominent would be Augustin Corno, who gave us the mathematics. What's called Corno oligopoly theory and so on comes from Augustin Corno back in the 1820s. And Jean-Baptiste Say, who was a complete believer in a utility maximizing view of human behavior, and equally utility maximizing view of capitalism as a system. And he was vehemently pro-capitalism, which I'm not criticizing here at the moment at all, but I'm saying he had a subjective theory of value, whereas the classical school was objective. So Ricardo, for example, at one stage said the price of products is set by the cost of production and not, as has often been said, by supply and demand. So Ricardo was anti-supply and demand. Most people, including neoclassical economists, don't realize that. But when Marx became the bastion of the classical school, this is in the 1860s and 1870s. At that stage, there was a very rapid turnover in economic teaching at the universities, where the subjective theory of value became dominant, and passing on from Say and Corno to Marshall and Jevons and Walras.
Can you briefly state what subjective versus objective theory of value would be?
Yeah. The objective values theory says that the price of something is set by cost of production. So they ultimately, the cost of production determines the price something sells for. Whereas the subjective theory says it's a combination of the utility maximizing desires of the buyer and the profit maximizing desires of the seller. The two together set the price. And as Marshall ultimately says, it is as ridiculous to ask whether supply and demand sets price as to ask which blade of a pair of scissors cuts the paper. So they saw both having to play a role. But they also came down to saying that it isn't just labor that is a source of value. Capital is also a source of value. Now, Marx, when you read Marx properly, and I think there are three people who have done that, I'm one of them, Rostowski is another, but most Marxists don't realize that Marx actually had an explanation for how capital can add value or be a source of surplus value in his terms. But I won't get into that here, but that's saying the Marxists don't read Marx properly. But anyway, the convention.
But let me ask you a clarifying question, because where we're headed, we're going to talk a lot about labor and value. Labor is pretty clear. It's the husbandman, it's the worker. Now, how do you define capital back then, and is it the same today?
That's one of the most difficult questions in economics.
Okay,
capital is fundamentally machinery. Yeah. Capital is a word for machinery, which we also use almost identically as a word for money.
Technology.
The accumulated value of money. And
money.
Okay, so but there is no simple mapping from the physical machines to the monetary value of machines, and we'll talk a bit about how an energy approach makes it easy to understand the role of machinery later in our conversation.
So with the old equations, if you substitute the word machinery for capital, and then you say labor and machinery in these 19th century formulas, that would be correct. That would be the same inferences.
That makes sense, yeah. So Marx argued
keep going.
Marx argued the physical machine adds no value to production. This is a distortion of his own philosophy, which is yet an issue for another day. But if you have the labor theory of value interpretation of Marx, a machine adds nothing. It simply contributes to the output what it cost to make it in the first place. And there's a famous phrase in Volume 1 of Capital, which says, no matter how productive a machine is, if it costs £150 to make, or three weeks of labour, then it adds to the product £150 or 3 weeks of labour. So it simply transfers its value, whereas the increase in value comes from labour. That was Marx's labour theory of value argument. Now that contributes to the whole political battle between workers and capitalists over who should get profit. Do capitalists deserve a profit, etc., etc.? And that was where the classical school suddenly became on the nose for most capitalists. So the subjective arguments of Say and Corno, and then ultimately Walras, Jevons, and Menger became much preferred. And I really don't know the politics of the switch in the 1870s, but in 1850s and mid-1860s, the classical school was still dominant at universities and dominant in public discourse. By the 1870s, it was the neoclassical school, which was completely dominant, and classicals were effectively marginalized, pardon the pun. So the marginal school takes over, and the argument is both labor and capital contribute to production and contribute to output.
So Marx actually directly or indirectly influenced the birth of what we refer to as neoclassical takeover of economics.
Yep. Now, when that happened, of course, the real thing I'm interested in is not Marx in particular. It's his piece of particular. He's an actor in causing this, but he's not the main stage.
Yep.
What started with the Physiocrats had the proto version of energy as the source of value. And that's correct.
Okay.
We know from the point of theory of thermodynamics, we know that there is a set amount of energy in the universe, and what humanity does in its manufacturing process is take significant concentrations of energy and use those to either convert energy to something more useful or to do motive force with that energy, and that is work, and that is what enables us to produce goods and services. But we cannot create energy. Okay? We take energy in one form, we transfer it into another. We actually degrade it according to the second law of thermodynamics. So there's no surplus in that sense. What there is a gap between the energy input needed to harness this free energy and the energy in the energy contained by that free source as well, the coal mine or et cetera, and that is what we're taking advantage of. So we should have an energy theory of production. And if we'd had the Physiocrats, we would have got there, because once the physicists, in that sense, caught up with the economists and developed the laws of thermodynamics, the economists said, that's what we've been talking about, and we can simply integrate perfectly with that. Instead, we got the wars between labor and capital, workers and capitalists over who's the source of value, and that completely ignored the role of energy.
And so the neoclassical economists, starting in the 1870s, continued to build on this separation from a biophysical physiocrat explanation of our wealth and productivity, kind of at the same time that coal started to expand. We had just found oil, and we started the Industrial Revolution in earnest. Then what happened in the field of economics and the description of our productivity and bring us gradually up to the present moment?
Well, you had Kane having a theory of production, which was fundamentally a multiplier version of investment and being multiplied by transfer between different sectors and so on. The first mathematical models came out with both Marx and the classical school and the neoclassical school, but there was still no, as we're used to today, no models, no theories of production, which are the mathematical equations saying, here are your inputs, there's your GDP as output.
So until that point, it was just stories and rhetoric. And all of a sudden, then at the late 19th century, we started to put math to it and equations.
Marshall and Volra and Jevons being the main three that did that. Marshall adding into the 1920s. But the first attempt to have an actual what's called an aggregate production function, so trying to relate the aggregate level of output to the aggregate level of inputs at the level of a macroeconomy, the first attempt to do that in the neoclassical school was the Cobb-Douglas production function. And in both the in Marshall's work and in Jevons' work, you can find this idea of inputs having marginal productivity. So you put a certain amount of labor in and you get a certain level of output. You add more labor, you get not as much increase in output as the previous level, but still some positive return. So this idea of marginal productivity of labor and marginal productivity of machinery, which turned up in the neoclassical theory. And I think in 1898 or early in the 1890s, J.B. Clark developed the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, which said that workers receive the marginal product and capitalists receive their marginal product. And so that concept became built into neoclassical theory. So the wage is supposed to reflect the contribution to output of the last worker hired, and the rate of profit is supposed to reflect the contribution to output of the last machine turned on.
But how did they know what percentage of the value of the product that was created was from the worker and from the machine?
Well, they didn't actually know in that sense, and they're wrong with the answers they gave. But the basic concept with the marginal productivity theory of income distribution was that the marginal products would be based upon the share of income in the share of income going to different what economists call factors of production. So if labour gets 75% of GDP, and that was roughly the term that applied in the 1920s, and capitalists get 25%, then the marginal product of labour is 0.75 and the marginal product of capital is 0.25. So that was the general expectation, but nobody put a mathematical number on it until Cobb and Douglas, one being a mathematician, the other being an economist, Douglas being the
And this
economist.
was 1920s, 1930s?
1928, I think it
Cobb and
was.
Douglas?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So they had painstakingly assembled a set of index numbers. Again, this is why it's important to know your history, because as well as knowing how things happen, you also know the context in which they happen. And today we're used to getting GDP figures off the Bureau of Economic Analysis every 3 months. Okay, and then we get a breakdown of the distributions from different sectors, and there's huge tables and statisticians, groups of statisticians involved in making this all look consistent. Back then, there were no numbers. There was a one person maintaining an index series for GDP, but there were no numbers on the amount of labour and no numbers on the amount of machinery. So Douglas made up fairly carefully, but put together a number of different series that he could find to produce an index of labour, an index of capital, and had this index of the output of machinery, not the entire GDP, that was pre-existing at the time, and put together annual data between 1899 and 1922. And then fitted that data, the mathematician Cobb doing the work there. Again, of course, this is on paper. We probably had manual calculators back then. I imagine it would be extremely expensive. They would have existed. Maybe it was done by hand, but the calculations were much, much more painstaking than we're used to today by pumping numbers into a computer program and almost instantly getting the result. So just 23 numbers, all index numbers, all starting at 100 in 1899, and then going through to different values in 1922. And when they did a regression against that, they used what's called a homogeneous of degree 1 production function. And what that means is that you had output being some constant, and it was a constant, not a variable, a constant multiplied by capital raised to 1 power times labour raised to 1 minus that power. And so the question was, what is the term? I'll call it alpha here because they use K and 1 minus K, and that's getting too confusing. Most economists use alpha for the share of machinery in GDP, or share of capitalist in GDP. Now, back at the time, roughly speaking, the share of capitalist in GDP was 25%. So the value for alpha is 0.25, and therefore the value for 1 minus alpha is 0.75. And the reason it's homogeneous of degree 1, if you multiply all labour and all capital, you double it, you get twice as much output because the exponents sum to 1. So that's the term they found. And lo and behold, the regression came back with values of 0.76 and 0.24. And they said, hey, this is so close to what we expected.
That's pretty close to 0.75 and 0.25.
Yeah. So they got a number which, and in fact, I've redone it just using a modern program, of course, and I get exactly 0.25. So you get a very strong apparent confirmation of their data, and the correlation. They gave this a correlation coefficient. The R squared is the square of that, of course, and the R squared for doing it now is 0.94. The correlation coefficient is 0.97. They're responsible. It looks fabulously high correlation coefficient, and it fits exactly what we expected from neoclassical theory. Now, they got a lot of pushback initially, but that was a major reason for why it became so popular, because the results looked very strong and they supported neoclassical theory.
But the entire formula was based on a data set from 1899 to 1922.
Yep. And what Cobb and Douglas did, they showed the numbers, the regression for regressing GDP against the index for capital and the index for labor. But they said that their change data also gave the same correlation coefficient of 0.97. And what they used was not what we'd use today, which is the annual change in the indices. We'd take the log and the log difference, or they'd look at percentage rate of change and say, what's the percentage rate of change? When you do it, and this is where I start finding a bit of, there's a hole in the bucket, dear Eliza. The correlation coefficient that they claimed was 0.97 for exactly the same value of alpha. So you got a higher confirming you didn't just get the high correlation with what GDP and out labor and capital, which are all growing. Okay, so there's a cover. The fact that they're all rising at the one time will give you higher correlation. They said same correlation coefficient, same value for alpha. When I do it, I get alpha of minus 0.15.
And why is that?
Because they didn't use the annual, the percentage change. They used the 3-year moving average. And I don't know, I wouldn't be able to find their original notes, but it wasn't the same result that they got for the data which was all rising at one time. And any statistician will tell you that if you have data which is all rising, you're going to get a high correlation coefficient just because they're all growing, not because they're related to each other. So we should be looking for the differences and try to get something where the trend should be around zero. And even that doesn't apply to the first differences here. But in other words, they didn't get the results that people accepted that they did, and the confidence people had in the results wasn't justified.
But people were confident. In the 1930s and 1940s, this was considered a valid and profound explanation of the inputs and outputs of an economic system describing our wealth and productivity.
Yeah. Now, we had all sorts of other approaches to how you model production in the meantime. And there was a long time, and this actually still applied when I was doing my PhD back in the 1980s or 1990s, that the neoclassical economists were doing what they call computable general equilibrium models. And these models had an input-output table as part of their production system. Now, that's all sorts of issues for them, which, again, that's tangential to what we're talking about. But at the same time, you had the rise of what they called themselves the Neoclassical Economists. And these were neoclassical economists who wanted to revive the idea of the market economy being perfectly flexible, get rid of this nasty Keynesian stuff. And they started using much more commonly the Cobb-Douglas production function, because they replaced an input-output model for production today with the idea of production over time, and they went back to a single commodity idea. This is the aggregate production function. And of course, they used the Cobb-Douglas production function. Now, we had 30 or 40 years of that, and typical neoclassicals, they don't know their own history. They've forgotten they ever used anything different to that, and all of them use a Cobb-Douglas production function, and they've all done what Solow brought in the 1950s, and that's bringing in what they call technological change as part of the system. So they have output as a product of the state of technology, which they use the capital letter A for, multiplied by labor to 1 minus alpha times capital to alpha. And that's where I think everything went wrong. Not that there was already going wrong with Cobb and Douglas, but this is where you got
it was already going wrong
economics.
With Adam Smith.
Yeah. It's error after error. Economics is, I can define economics as compound error.
All right. We're going to eventually translate all this, because I'm mostly tracking with, you're an economist and you're a friend and you care about the system of humans and our planet, but you're also here, you're functioning as a historian, which is a totally separate skill that you have. And I've talked to you offline on what you've all been working on, and it's quite the detective story. So keep going and bring us up to the present. So what did Solow do?
Well, you started with the Cobb and Douglas having their function was a constant multiplied by L to the 1 minus alpha times K to the 1 to K to the alpha as the production function. Now, then one of the criticisms that was made of Cobb and Douglas by other neoclassicals is, well, where's technological change here? And Solow said, well, we can bring technological change in. This is in 1956, and says 57. We can bring it in. And the way we have to do it, there's a cost. I'll actually read them here. The new wrinkle I want to describe is an elementary way of segregating variations in output per head due to technical change from those due to changes in the availability of capital per head. Naturally, every additional bit of information has its price. In this case, the price consists of one new required time series, which is the share of labour in total income, and one new assumption. And here we go. That factors are paid their marginal products. In other words, rather than being a mathematical derivation by Cobb and Douglas that alpha is 0.25 and 1 minus alpha is 0.75, let's just assume that they're what the current values of the share of labour and capital in output are. Alpha is 0.3, which means capitalists get 30% of output, and labour gets 0.7. So we just assume that, and then we fit the data to the we have a data series for labour, a data series for capital, a data series for GDP. We don't have technology, so the gap between the result we get for GDP and the sum of labour and capital is what they call the growth of technological change. And that ended up being 0.85. So 85% of the variation in output was explained not by the proportions of labour and capital to each other, but by this technological component, and that became known as the Solow residual.
So hold on a second. So from 1928 onwards, they had 75% was described by labor and 25% by capital of our productivity. Productivity is basically could be said our wealth change year over year. Then 30 years later, they changed it and said that 85% is unexplained, but it's by some change in technology.
Yeah.
And how does technology in Solow's definition versus your definition, how does technology differ from capital?
Well, this is the problem. Technology, in my opinion, is embodied in capital. Okay. In that sense, when we have technological change, what we get is new machines that have a higher capacity to process energy and produce more complex goods than the previous ones had. So Cobb and Douglas were in that sense right not to differentiate out technology and capital.
Right.
But by Solow bringing in this idea of a residual, first of all, he assumed that the exponents for labour and capital were given by income distribution data. By that stage, it was 30% going to capitalists rather than 25%.
So he did do data from the 1920s to the 1950s, and the 0.25, 0.75 shifted to 0.3 and 0.7.
That's what he found. When if you look in his paper, he does include the national distribution of income, and it's pretty much 30%, 70% capitalists and workers.
But he found, he looked at the numbers and said, wait a minute, there's something not right here. And when you find a residual of something, a residual effect, sometimes it's 5% or 10%, but in his case, it was 85%.
85%.
The vast majority of the productivity was could not be described by capital and labor.
Well, actually 87.5% in his initial paper. And that's okay in one sense. You can say, well, most of our improvement isn't a case of adding more labour or more capital or getting the ratio between labour and capital correct. It's technological change. But fundamentally, that was because technological change turns up in the machines, and the labour component, when we're talking about unskilled workers, you basically have people working on a process line. I've actually done that at some stage in my youth. But you just get told, press this button, pull this lever, stick that thingamajig on that whatchamacallit, and that's your role. Okay. So where the technological change actually turns up is in the machine itself. So if you go back before I worked as a manual hand inside a factory at one stage, you would have used rivets to weld aluminium together, and now you're using spot welding machines. And so the technology is actually embodied in the machinery. And this is where the confusion of machines with money becomes a a reason why your mind gets clouded if you don't distinguish the two. But the terms we use, capital for machinery and capital for money and capitalist for the social class, does confuse the matters. And what I'm talking about is progressive confusion.
Yeah, I'm a little confused myself now, but I know you're telling a really important story, which you outlined to me on the phone. I mean, on our call earlier this
Mm.
week. So keep going.
Okay.
And by the way, um, from Marx onward, Marx and Cobb and Douglas and Solow in the 1950s, they're all using terms like land and capital and technology, and the word energy is found nowhere
Pretty
in these
much.
papers,
Yeah, the
correct?
only one who really does. I mean, for example, Marshall talks about energy. I think he uses the word 79 times in his Principles of Economics. Every last time talking about the innovative spirit of humans, not energy as you
Right.
and I mean
Energy
it.
is our yeah, not
Yeah, oh, geez,
fossil
that person's got
energy,
lots of
but the
energy,
human
and
spirit.
yeah, human spirit. So he actually talked about energy as various raw materials, which of course contain energy, coal and oil as inputs. But when it came to talking about energy itself, there was no awareness of the theories of thermodynamics or the role of energy as a production force. Whereas in Marx was actually reading the early thermodynamic workers and going to lectures in London and so on. So there's more awareness of the role of energy in Marx than there is in the neoclassicals. But what's happened is energy's dropped completely out of the picture at this stage. So first of all, Cobb and Douglas give you a theory of production which fits the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. They give you coefficients which are what neoclassicals expect them to do, but they're derived from the data. And then along comes Solow and said, let's assume those coefficients are correct. So the marginal product of labour is zero point 0.7 and it is equal to their contribution, their share of GDP. And then let's work out the residual. And oh my God, 87.5, but that's okay. We're talking about technological change. But it was an unnecessary fudge. And it then shielded neoclassical economists from looking at the data again to see whether the uh, share of workers in GDP is equivalent to the contribution that labour makes to output and capital makes to output. And that's where it goes all awry because when you take a look at the data that Solow was looking at and data subsequent to that, the and you do a regression based on the change in white GDP, the change in labour, and change in capital, rather than getting a coefficient for labour for capital of zero point 0.3, which is close to the income distribution, you get a coefficient for capital of 0.85. And that suddenly means, hang on a sec, we've got a contradiction between an empirically derived term for the contribution of capital to output and the theory of income distribution. The return to capital is actually much higher. So the exponent for capital is much higher than capital share in GDP. And suddenly we would have seen this if Solow hadn't jumped in with the idea of separating our technological change from capital itself.
Oh, so that was a like red herring that took us down a different flawed pathway on understanding the production function.
Yeah,
So
and
what
leaving
happened after? Go ahead.
we're leaving energy out all the way through. So what we have is in the neoclassical camp the idea that labour and capital get the payment of the labour and capital reflects their marginal product becomes just ingrained in the mindset of neoclassicals, and they stick with the coefficients that Solow first worked out in 1957, in half a century,
Still
more than half
today.
a still today. They haven't changed them. So if you look at almost any neoclassical paper, it will assume the exponent for capital is zero point 0.3 and the exponent for labour is zero point 0.7.
Using data that Solow used from 1928 to 1950s.
Yeah, if anybody's smart, they might go and take a look at the income distribution and find that capital now gets 40% and labour gets 60%, so they change to the zero point 0.4 and zero point 0.6. But they simply assume they can use the income distribution data to choose what the exponents are in the production function.
When you're getting a PhD in economics today, or when you
Yeah.
were in school, was it a requirement to read these fundamental papers
Oh,
of
no.
Marshall and Cobb Douglas and Marx? No?
No, I mean, this is one of the reasons why neoclassical economics has gone so totally off the rails. They don't even know their own history. And so if you go like when I went through, you had to sit through master's courses on advanced micro and advanced macro and so on. They were part of, there's now what's called in America ABD, all but dissertation. So
Hmm.
you do, and the American system has enormous coursework load. And I'm not sure, thankfully, I didn't go through the American system, but I think something like 2/3 of your time is spent doing courses rather than writing a thesis. And you don't go back. The oldest paper you might read is one where the Lucas critique was developed in the 1970s. So they just don't know their own history.
What's the Lucas critique?
Oh, that's another rabbit hole. But arguing that macro should be based on micro. That's the fundamental
Okay.
idea behind the Lucas critique.
Okay. So from Adam Smith to Marx to Marshall to Cobb and Douglas to Solow,
Mm,
we've had a progression away from the physiocrats of something physical. Back in France, it was land
mm.
and the free energy from the earth. And then we had a bonanza of fossil carbon added to our economic system. What happened next? Solo all the way to the present day, or was there another
Solo all the way to the
wrong
present day
turn?
in terms of the production function that neoclassicals use. And then, of course, energy. We've got to bring our people back to energy all the time because the thing is, what happened to energy? We know energy is
Yeah.
absolutely critical for production, but it's left out of these theories. And you then had a group of uh, non-orthodox economists, Bob Ayres being the main one, a
Hmm.
physicist who became uh, fascinated with economics and then realized economics didn't include the role of energy and thought we've got to bring energy into production, working with Kummel and quite a range of other
Yeah,
non-orthodox
I,
economists.
I
Often
know
then,
both Bob and Reiner,
and so did I.
and
Did
you. Yeah,
so poor old Bob partying, what, about 3, 4 weeks ago? Um,
I know, I
Maybe
saw that.
2 months ago now. I'm glad I got to see him. Would have been only 2 months before he died in Holland at a conference that we caught up. But anyway, so working with Bob, I thought we've got to bring energy in. There simply has to be a way of bringing energy into production. And what Kummel and Bob were doing was at some point they went from using total numbers to index numbers in what they call the Linux production function. This was an attempt to bring energy in, but through the legs of the Cobb-Douglas production function. So at some point, they had the idea of index number values for output, uh, labor, energy, and capital being part of the way they derive the Linux function. And my discomfort was that fundamentally what they were doing, and this is what neoclassicals themselves have also done, is add energy in as an additional factor of production. So you say the way you produce output is you combine labor and capital and energy. Now, there's two problems with that. Okay. One is that if you combine labor independently and machinery independently and energy production independently, you don't have output, you've got an explosion. Okay. Energy has to be an input to labor and capital. And so what had finally occurred to me, literally while being in Bob Ayres' flat in France, which was full of statues, that walking through it one day on a trip from the bathroom, the little thought popped in my brain: labor without energy is a corpse, capital without energy is a sculpture. I went, bang, that's it. And I sat down at a
That's
table,
it.
5 minutes, typing in a program called MathCAD as it happens, and fed that into the Cobb-Douglas production function. So the basic idea was that energy is not an independent factor. It's a factor you have to input to labor in one form and input into machinery in a different form. Otherwise, they can't produce anything.
So said differently, the laborers need food
Yep,
and housing and shelter and such, and the machines, capital, need to be turned on and powered by electricity or heat or movement,
exactly.
which absolutely
Exactly.
requires energy. Without energy, the machines are worthless.
Yeah. Now, what then happened out of that was that, the Cobb-Douglas production function, if I fed energy as an input to labor, the basic point was that is the number of workers you've got times how much energy they consume multiplied by how much of that energy is used in production. Now, if we go back to the days of the Roman slaves, most of the energy they consumed went into production. They were, fed a pittance, worked to the bone, and therefore if they got given like 200 watts equivalent of energy input, they could put out 100 watts output, and so their factor is 50%. But if you fast forward to today, you and I are surrounded by energy. We're consuming tens of thousands of watts of energy in our houses, with our devices, the
Mm-hmm.
heating, hot water,
Mm-hmm.
etc., etc. But only a tiny amount of our energy actually now goes into production. And fundamentally, the amount of physical work we can do runs out at about 100 watts. And I'm terrible on the terms, by the way, being an economist. I haven't been properly trained on the terms of energy and watts and joules and so on. So I'll make all sorts of mistakes there. But the basic point is the energy input of a worker to production is, in terms of actual measures of energy, is no greater than it was 2,000 years ago, because we haven't evolved in any sense to be able to consume more energy and output more energy. On the other hand, machinery has had an incredible increase in the energy input that a machine can take. My favorite instance, I like what Musk is doing with SpaceX. Okay, so I'm a bit of a space junkie, and a friend of mine was being abusive about this, the last rocket blowing up, and I worked out what was the energy equivalent of the energy inside that rocket. It was 1/3 of a Hiroshima bomb. Now, for that to actually not lead to an explosion that devastated Boca Chica, but led to a rocket taking off and reaching 100 kilometers above the surface in a few minutes, that is the amount of energy that the ultimate machine of our day can consume. If you go back to James Watt's steam engine, it was about 30 tons of coal a day. Now, that's a damn sight less than 1/3 of a Hiroshima bomb. So most of what we've seen as a growth in our wealth, our growth in the consumption levels we have, has come from that increase in energy. And now we're cooking with gas in that sense, because we're finally acknowledging the role of energy in production. But that's not what neoclassicals are doing, of course.
So this was a story of kind of false turns at intersections all the way. And now, what would a neoclassical economist listening to this last 45 minutes of say to you in rebuttal or defense or contradiction or alarm?
I'm getting a bit of fun here. Rudy, if you're listening, Rudy Bachman solved me the case of saying what a neoclassical economist would say by actually saying what he said in a paper,
Okay.
because now I'm going to come down to how have economists, on the very few occasions they've tried to include energy in a Cobb-Douglas production function, what they've done and what they've therefore deduced about the role of energy in production. And really thinks I haven't got a sense of humor, but I laugh at him all the time. So I want to show why I do that. So Bachman and co, about 3 or 4 authors, wrote a paper for a German language working paper with an English translation on the issue of what's going to happen to output and the GDP of Germany if we're cut off from Russian energy during the Ukraine war. And the argument they made was done by saying, we're going to include energy in the Cobb-Douglas production function. Now, what they did, and this is where the mistakes compound upon mistakes, is they took the standard coefficients of 0.7 and 0.3 and then said, let's allocate 0.04 of capital's coefficient to energy. So you still got the same homogeneous production
because energy is 4% of
4% of GDP. Therefore, okay, the coefficient is 0.04, and this is where you get the total. This is where the twist comes in. Because the coefficient is 0.04, the mathematics of the Cobb-Douglas production function then tells you that the contribution of energy to change in output is also 0.04.
But all of the labor and all of the machinery is fully dependent on the energy.
Far more important. Now, here I'm going to get some quotes out of Rudy here. Okay, so they compared their work to the what's called the Leontief production function, which we haven't even mentioned yet, but I'll bring that in now. And Vasily Leontief is one of the few winners of the Nobel Prize that I absolutely applaud. He was a Russian mathematician stroke economist, and he gave us input-output analysis and a whole range of other positive contributions. But when looking at the ratio of the level of capital and level of output in most economies, doing whatever, however the numbers were developed, what he realized was the ratio of labor of capital to output was roughly constant. Different between different countries, very different between developing and developed countries, but generally speaking, the ratio, whichever way, was roughly constant. And he then said you could use that as an aggregate production function. So rather than saying the aggregate level of output is, labor to 1 power times capital to 1 minus that power, you said output is capital divided by a capital output ratio. And it was just an empirical regularity. And the post-Keynesian school, which I'm part of, basically said that'll be our production function. So rather than the complicated neoclassical with exponents and marginal products, etc., we just say output is K divided by V, and V normally, in terms of the conventional figure, people normally used about 3 for the value of V. So output each year is 1/3 the value of capital that same year. And that's what and then we get ridiculed for that. And because they say, oh, you don't enable the possibility of substitution between labor and capital as input. So you must be less sophisticated than we are with a production function that can enable for substitution of labor for capital. So Rudy then dived in this and took a look and compared the Cobb-Douglas production function to the Leontief using a form which is called constant elasticity of substitution, but I won't go into that. Basically, in regard to Cobb-Douglas at one extreme of that and the Leontief at the other. And they said that if you have the standard Cobb-Douglas production function, then it tells you that if you have a 10% fall in energy inputs, you will have a 0.4% fall in GDP.
So we lose 10% of our energy and GDP goes down by 0.4%.
Yeah. Now,
that's ridiculous.
I know. Okay, you and I both know that's ridiculous. But he didn't know that because they don't look at the data. So what they then said was that, and this is the quote from Rudy's paper, the heading is Extreme Scenarios with Low Elasticity of Subsumption and Why Leontief Production at the Macro Level is Nonsensical. So as I said, so they had the blue dashed line in the figure shows that output falls 1-for-1 with energy supply in the Leontief case. The marginal product of energy jumps to 1 over alpha, which is the exponent they use for it, so 1 over 0.04, while the marginal product of the other factors falls to 0, and then here's an assumption. If factor prices equal marginal products, this then implies the price of energy jumps to 1 over alpha and prices of others fall to 0. This also implies expenditure and energy jumps to 100%, blah, blah, blah. We consider these predictions to be economically nonsensical. They are. But not because the Leontief case is wrong. Leontief actually fits the data. It's because the assumption that wages equal marginal product of labor is wrong. So it's an empirical contradiction of the neoclassical theory of production. And the basic argument is that they think that production is quite insensitive to energy. That's also a quote from the paper. So because the exponent of 0.04, that means that it's 10% change in energy causes 0.4% change in output. So labor is far more significant than labor and capital second, and energy a far distant third. When you look on the data, energy is 100% of the answer.
Explain that. What is the truth based on all your work with Bob Ayres and Rainer Kummel and others? What is the actual equation of labor and capital and whatever other variables?
The basic truth is that output is fundamentally energy transformed into a useful form. If you take a look at the rate of growth of energy, in the rate of change of energy and the rate of change of GDP at the global level, you find a correlation coefficient for them. I'm looking for this now of 0.7 roughly, and the relationship between change in GDP and change in energy is change in GDP is 0.97 times change in energy.
Yeah.
So in other words, fundamentally what GDP is energy transformed into useful work.
And so the core flawed assumption, which is taken built upon some basic flawed assumptions and changed over centuries, is that we can describe our wealth. I mean, it's almost like there's been a supernova the last 2 centuries of energy use and wealth and productivity, and people are just trying to scramble in real time, putting math equations on that, and increasingly divorced from the truth because the supernova keeps growing, and so the energy blindness is that adding more energy, particularly energy dense fossil energy, to the whole thing every year, that itself, that little addition of more energy, is a big explainer of our productivity.
It's the fundamental explainer. And therefore, what we've really done over time is develop machines which can handle more and more energy, more and more precisely. That's where our wealth has come from. And economists have been blind to that by having this, first of all, incursion by Adam Smith to throw out the Physiocrats and say labor's the source of value. And then you have the neoclassical saying it's labor and capital. Then you had Cobb and Douglas saying, oh, it's 0.7 and 0.3, which means that the contribution of labor to change in output is 70%, and the contribution of capital is 30%. That then gets locked in by Solow, turning their empirical non-discovery into an assumption, and then putting it all in technological change, which becomes disembodied from capital itself, but also hides them from the fact that the relationship doesn't hold up on the data anymore anyway. And now when they come to energy, they just tack it on as a third factor and give it a coefficient based on the percentage of energy in GDP, which is trivially low, and therefore say energy has almost no role in production, which is complete bollocks.
And part of the reason is that the energy input into our machines and into our economy is only the cost of energy that it is to extract, plus a little profit for the oil company or whatever. It's not the value that it provides, which is 4 or 5 years of my physical labor and all
each
that.
barrel of oil, yeah.
I mean, this is seriously, this is Nobel Prize sort of observation, I think, because it's so decoupled from what people say at high positions of authority in our world. Again, I'll ask you, would just a standard economist, not Rudy, someone you know, but just anyone listening to this who has a PhD in economics, or maybe someone who's in grad school getting a master's or a PhD in economics, listening to this program, is their initial reaction going to be one of critical rejection? Steve doesn't know what he's talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Or is it like, yeah?
Absolutely. I mean,
because it affects their identity, or because they know otherwise in their research?
It affects their identity. I mean, the younger one might actually go, oh, hang on, that's surprising. You'll get a few who might react that way and change, but the old ones are locked in their ways.
Okay, so speak to the young ones right now.
Okay.
If they're curious about this and something doesn't sit right with what they've been told and what they've just heard, what would you recommend that they do to get clarity on the truth?
The main thing is to realize that economics can't be derived from the laws of thermodynamics, but it can't be inconsistent with them either. And what you're being taught within your production functions and so on is leaving out the role of energy in an absolutely critical way. Now, if you go and want to do it empirically, you go and take a look at what is the relationship between energy and production, drive it empirically, and you'll find that it's somewhere between like a point. GDP is 0.7 to say 0.95, 0.97 as I got in that particular Excel regression of the value of change in GDP. So the fundamental insight from a thermodynamical point of view within economics is that at the first approximation, GDP is energy turned into useful work. And then that means that the whole argument you were taught in neoclassical economics that the wage reflects the marginal product of labor is completely wrong. The wage and the return to capital, for that matter, have nothing to do with their contribution to production. What labor and capital do is harness energy successfully in factories to produce output. And that will normally be done with machines. The machines have very fixed ratios of workers per machine and energy throughput per machine. So fundamentally, you get a fixed ratio, and that sense, the Leontief is an empirical observation we now have an explanation for. That explanation is that the Leontief production function is actually output is equal to machinery multiplied by the efficiency with which machines turn energy into useful work.
Neoclassical economists, I mean, back when I was in school, are among the smartest people in my class. And smart people can be fooled, but they're not dumb. So, like, really, it still today boggles my mind how neoclassical economists can totally neglect energy, given anyone with 3 minutes on the internet can find that a barrel of oil has 5.7 million BTUs in it, which is, a lot of energy relative to the 0.6 kilowatt hours that I do per day. So what do they really think this?
They really do. And the trouble is this is where your mind gets set by your training. So if you get trained on the idea that production is a combination of technology, labor, and capital, and energy doesn't even turn up there, you don't even think about energy, and you can be completely energy blind in the sense that I lead that book with, that we're like, we know humans know about as much about energy as fish do about water. They simply take it for granted. And then you see this when neoclassicals actually come to pose themselves the question of what is the role of energy in production. So this is from the paper by Bachmann and co. about the impact of the loss of Russian energy on German output, and to take the Cobb-Douglas production function and differentiate it with respect to the inputs, and then say that the role of we can say what's going to happen to GDP from a change in energy. And here's a quote from the paper. Therefore, for example, a drop in energy supply of minus 10% reduces production by 0.4%, which shows that production is quite insensitive to energy as expected. This is expected.
Production is quite insensitive to
energy as expected. Expected by neoclassical economists.
Right. It's a tautology of sorts.
It's a tautology. They think that energy has a trivial role because it has no role in their production function. But when you revise
why aren't there people calling them on this? Like a
well, I am, but
prime minister or a senator or a CEO.
They all do. They all do one unit of economics. They all get the idea of labor and capital producing output and the production function if they go that detailed in first year. But fundamentally, they get taught the whole idea that we get paid our factor products, and that actually ideologically is very reinforcing for a CEO, because it says my enormous weight per salary is because of my huge contribution to production. So it ends up having an ideological role, and that blinds them to the physical reality that you simply don't have that impact on production. If you come down to the nuts and bolts of it, it's energy which is producing the output, and you are getting a share of it, and now an overblown share given your system and the power structure of capitalism.
So if we truly defined energy correctly in the production function, that giant gift from nature might not all be funneled to the top the way it is now.
And that, of course, leads to one of the reasons why people continue being energy blind, because it enables them to be blind to their outsized share of the wealth of the civilization that goes their way.
And also continues to indicate why we're blind to the waste component as well, because that, if you include that reduces. Yeah.
The other side of the production function is waste, and when I do the Ontia function, which makes sense, so with the empirical reinterpretation or the logical reinterpretation of the empirical regularity of Leontief, that output is capital divided by capital output ratio, becoming output is capital times the efficiency with which machines turn energy into useful work. That coefficient is going to be less than 0.5, substantially less than 0.5. So it means most of what we produce is waste energy. You can quantify it and say if the efficiency with which machines turn energy useful work is about roughly 0.2 or 0.25, then 0.8 to 0.75 is of energy input produces waste. And that's what we dump into the environment. And that, of course, feeds back and damages our capacity to produce output. If we had that insight 50 or 60 years ago, we would never have got to the conundrum we are in now of relying so much upon fossil fuel energy for our production today.
Okay, I'm going to ask you an easier question, but it might be a harder question for you specifically, Steve. What would you tell to a graduate student learning about the world in another discipline like philosophy or French or chemistry or biology who will never take a class in economics? Why is it important? Can you, to those people, why is it important that energy underpins the production function and that our economists and therefore our politicians and such have been misled about the core driver of our wealth the last century plus?
Fundamentally, human civilization only exists because we exploit energy. If we didn't have energy in the form of the coal and oil deposits we found, we would still be sitting around fireplaces, starting fires with flints. Uh, we might have a moderately sophisticated culture to the stage that you got with your animal power and slave power under Romans and the medieval period and serfs and so on. But there wouldn't be the philosophy, there wouldn't be the art, there wouldn't be the computers that we take for granted today. So if we don't understand the role of energy, we don't understand where our civilization came from.
And how does your view and that of Bob Ayres and Rainer Kummel and other what we might call biophysical economists, or in your case, post-Keynesian economists, how does your current understanding of energy and the production function differ from the biophysical economists that started to gain traction in the 1970s? Howard Odum and George Rogan and Charlie Hall and such. Is it nuanced? Is it different?
No,
Okay.
it's just basically finding a better way to put it together. I mean, for example, Bob, of course, was in the house when I made that discovery, was staying in his flat. And it took me 10 minutes or less to work out the mathematics. It's ridiculously simple. But he then just said that solves it. That brings in the role of energy. So because neither he nor Kummel had ever thought making energy an input into labor and capital. They had energy as a third factor. And once you just say it's got to be an input, it all falls apart, falls together, pardon me.
I totally agree with that. But here's what I don't understand.
Mm.
If we don't have energy, all technologies are sculptures. And
Yeah.
I added to your statement and said cities are museums.
Mm.
But we do have energy, and we're probably going to have less energy in the future. But how we use that energy, how we combine that energy with materials and human imagination and creativity, that does add something to just the raw value of the energy. So it's
Absolutely.
really
Yeah.
so it's the combination of machines, raw materials like copper and silicon and
Phosphorus.
neodymium and
Mm.
phosphorus, and the fire.
Mm.
Some electrons or flame, either kinetic or potential energy, and that comes with up with a product that humans value. And so how do you distinguish the contribution of actually the flame or the electrons versus the machine and the new invention?
I'm actually going to go right back to 1774 and give you an
Okay.
explanation for that. And I quote this in my new book because I think Turgot wrote one of the most brilliant paragraphs in the history of economics. And I just wish this had been where economics came from rather than 1776, 2 years later, with Adam Smith. So pardon me reading out a substantial slab and looking above the camera to do it. The husbandman is, and because the mistakes are seeing this as being with agriculture, is any production system, including manufacturing, obviously. The husbandman is the only person whose labour produces something over and above the wages of labour. He is therefore the sole source of all wealth. The land pays him directly the price of his labour, independently of any other man or agreement. Nature does not bargain with him to oblige him to content himself with what is absolutely necessary. What she grants is proportional neither to his wants nor to contractual valuation of the price of his days of labour. And this is one of the punchlines. It is the physical result of the fertility of the soil and of the wisdom, far more than of the laboriousness, of the means with which he is employed to render it fertile. So that's the role of humans involving concepts changing how we bring out the energy. As soon as the husband produces more than his wants, he can, with this superfluity that nature records him as a pure gift, over and above the wages of his toil, there's energy return and energy invested by the labours of the other members of society. This latter, in selling to him, gain only their livelihood, but the husband gathers, beyond his subsistence, a wealth which is independent and disposable, which he has not bought and which he sells. Now, all the ideas we're talking about are tied up in that one paragraph.
Earlier, you said you had a quote that you start with a seed and you plant it, and nature gives you back 1,000 seeds. But what if the husbandman was really clever and found out a way to plant a seed and get back 2,000 seeds? The gift would still be from nature, but it was doubled because of his creativity and intelligence.
And that's the line in the middle. It is the physical result of the fertility of the soil and of the wisdom, far more so than the laboriousness. So in the tenets of wisdom, what he's saying is we devise new ways of doing different things, and that wisdom is far more important than the effort we put in physically to do it. So again, our ideas play an essential role. And we wouldn't be able to exploit this free energy without our minds that can devise new ways of harnessing the energy far more rapidly and far more effectively. So the wisdom is definitely in there, and the wisdom itself turns up in the machines. So it is embodied in the machines. So all this stuff, it said right back in 7 to 74, that paragraph has far more wisdom than the whole wealth of nations.
So this is all kind of testable, although we're on a roller coaster ride. So I think there's a possibility, and I know this is a totally separate conversation, that that we could lose 20% of our energy in coming decades for various reasons, or more. But let's just say 20%. So I would think that would cause a 20% or more drop in GDP. What would economists say?
I'd say it cause a 0.8% drop in GDP. If they use the
0.8.
Yeah. That's a strict.
And you think most economists actually believe that?
Yep, I do. I've worked with them for long enough to know they swallow this stuff. So if you look at when you look at the data, like changing in GDP and change in energy, that's figure 57 at the moment in my book. It may change, but it's such a one-for-one relationship. It's ridiculous, and yet they don't even look at it. And that when Rudy made that, Berkman and friends made that comment about the 10% fall in energy, 0.4% fall in GDP. Obviously, they didn't look at the data, and they ridiculed Leontiev when Leontiev actually reproduces the data.
That would be like the opposite of a Nobel Prize. We should develop something like that.
Well, the Nobel Prize is the opposite of a Nobel Prize. You are aware of that?
No, okay. So there's
in
that.
Economics, yeah, there's synergy.
All right. Big picture. Let's move to the stratosphere here. What are the implications of everything that you've said for our modern society and for our future, and for our decisions and planning for that moment?
The fundamental grounding is that without energy, there is no GDP. And we have been getting our energy out of fossil fuel forms. And of course, with fossil fuels, we generate carbon dioxide. That is causing global warming, and that is destabilizing the climate on which our production systems depend. Now, we've been blind of that, particularly the economists who so-called specialists in climate change, William Nordhaus and friends, have no idea of this either.
So that's another flaw in the production function, is there's not the waste capacity that feeds back in to the biosphere that is our only source of wealth, because without oxygen and viable ecosystems, we all die.
Yeah. Now, that's not concluded in the way the neoclassicals think about climate change. And that's why you've got nonsense statements like by Nordhaus, for example, saying that it's really, really difficult to find any direct impacts of the expected climate change on the bulk of the economy in the next 50 to 75 years. Now, by the bulk of the economy meant all of manufacturing, he even included all of mining, services, industries, government, etc., etc. He could see no way in which climate change will affect that. Well, if we have if we get like a blanket ban on using fossil fuels because of totally destructive change to the climate in the next 5 years or so, or 10 years, there'll be an incredible plunge in GDP, and we're not prepared for it at all.
And I think if James Hansen and his colleagues are right, we're going to have a spike in climate warming temperatures in 2024 because we're shifting from the PDO from La Nina to El Nino on the backs of the sulfur aerosols being reduced as a masking of the thermal inertia. So we're going to see, and if we go up a half a degree Celsius next year, as they're suggesting, that's going to have massive impacts around the world. And then, yes, you're right. People are going to be like, oh my God, this is like real and our emissions are rising and fossil energy is to blame. But I think most people still don't understand the deep linkage between fossil energy and the size and scope of our economy because they're energy blind.
Yeah, and economists have contributed to this blindness rather than clarifying that it's actually absolutely essential.
And on your previous podcast here, this is your third appearance on this show, you predicted that economists, because of their identities and status and built personal situation, they will not change until there's a crisis. So can we anticipate what's going to happen with the environment, with oil depletion, though that's going to happen gradually, with what's coming and create some blueprints and break grass in case of emergency plans that are actually based on what a physiocrat might advise the French king, the modern equivalent of that? Can we do that?
I think it's incredibly late timing to be doing that, but we, as you know, we've depended on fossil fuels for about 85% of our energy.
Yeah.
And that hasn't changed much in the last 20 years. It's gone down to some extent for some time because of growth in fossil fuel production, decline in hydroelectric, which is the main form. That's the main form of renewables even now is hydroelectric. It's not wind and solar. So we have potentially we're going to see quite serious climate catastrophes coming our way. The ones that most of the climate scientists I'm in touch with are scared about are a global famine caused by a collapse in food output from one of the wheat belts or corn belts of the world, and that then leading to social breakdown because suddenly we haven't got the food we need. Or wet bulb catastrophe is the other one, which would hit third world countries more than it would hit Westerns probably. But something which is catastrophic, which causes a massive collapse in population, and then leads to probably rogue behaviour by governments around the world then, because we haven't managed to even reach an agreement to phase out fossil fuels at the last COP-out meeting. It'll be every country for itself in what could be a very chaotic environment, will be a very chaotic environment if we see something like a global famine.
So you're saying that we shouldn't look to the neoclassical economists who are the current economic shaman and cheerleaders of our cultural narrative of the early 21st century. We shouldn't look to them to change their minds and chart a different course.
They will be the most shocked and most confused by what happens completely. They're useless. They've led us astray. It's just been a cascade of errors right back to Smith, as I've said, that led us to the situation. But the last people who have any understanding of the physical role of production on the planet are economists. And the last ones who realize the dangers of climate change are also economists. So I would just kick them out of the room. They don't belong here.
I tend to agree, but let me play devil's advocate. There are a lot of bright, pro-future young people in college, in graduate school, in postgraduate. Couldn't some of them take the kernels of truth bombs that you've been laying out here and contribute to the science and understanding and translate between what you're saying and what the traditional neoclassical economics departments around the world? I suspect your answer is going to be no, because their boss and the people that gets the funding are the tenured economists, and they're not going to fund this sort of a research. Or what do you think?
No, it's a waste of time. I mean, the young ones are some of the young ones are worth reaching. To say, look, for God's sake, join rethinking economics, fight against your curriculum. But fundamentally, if you want people to give you a guidance right now, it's going to be the engineers. And they're the ones we should be, get the engineers to look at it. The first thing an engineer is going to look at is the energy supply. And that's just the nature of training of engineers. It's all about how you use energy and how you direct it to produce useful outcomes rather than blowing things up. So the engineers are the ones we need to rely upon, and we should have been getting them to build the alternative technologies in the last 40 or 50 years rather than getting a lot of them to go off and work out as financial engineers instead and give us speculative bubbles in real estate and shares. So we have had a huge misdirection of our intelligence for the last 40 or 50 years. And again, economists are to blame for that.
When does your book come out, and what's it called?
Hopefully it'll be coming out. It depends upon the publisher's process, of course, but hopefully by March, I would say. And the title is going to be Rebuilding Economics from the Top Down.
Well, I've read the energy chapter, and it is quite compelling. Steve, you and I talk about what's going on now in the world, but I didn't know a lot of the things that you have dug up by reading these original papers. You also told me that most people in economics don't even read these original papers. So
no, they never go back and read the originals. It's just terrible. Yeah.
So this was a little bit of a Sherlock Holmes treatment of the history of the production function and the complete absence of energy in describing our wealth and productivity. And yet energy is embedded in everything, including the labor and capital functions. Do you have any closing words for listeners who might be a little shell-shocked by this conversation?
Just the main thing comes down to how economists, by not understanding energy, have trivialized the dangers of climate change. So we are likely to see that striking this decade. I mean, we both know the potential 0.5 degree increase in global temperatures out of both El Nino plus the hypothetical role of leaving the sulfur emissions as being masking some increase in global temperatures. That should cause absolutely chaotic weather, probably starting in the next northern summer. So it's going to be brutally soon that this starts happening, and we have to prepare as soon as possible. So all the XR activists dial it up. Engineers start realizing we have to, as soon as possible, start producing whatever alternative systems we can work out to reduce the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere as soon as possible. That's the most important thing, to have some potential to hang on to human civilization over the next 2 decades. If we don't do it, it's back to the Stone Age.
Thank you, Steve. As always, to be continued, my friend, and good luck with your book and all your future sleuthing.
Oh, indeed.
If you enjoyed or learned from this episode of The Great Simplification, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform and visit thegreatsimplification.com for more information on future releases. This show is hosted by Nate Hagens, edited by No Troublemakers Media, and curated by Leslie Badlutz and Lizzie Siriani.